All right, good afternoon, business law students once again. We are up to chapter 10. And so chapter 8, we basically looked at some of the elements of contracts, kind of give us a good working understanding of what it takes to make a contract. Chapter 9, we looked at some of the legality, enforceability, and really it's just sort of a good, I like that chapter a lot because if you're going to be in business or especially as I stated, dealing in an e-commerce landscape, you have to be very mindful of there's a lot less face-to-face contracts now than there were in the past before we, have such a dependence on the internet and e-commerce and e-contracts, et cetera. So as a business owner, you have to be very mindful that if you're entering into a contract and it comes out, you're dealing with somebody who was drunk or mentally incompetent or a minor, there may be some enforceability aspects to that that you just have to be very mindful of. So, that's a really good chapter. The assumption is everybody, I think, is kind of, if you're entering into a contract, you're kind of on the same page, but that's not always the case. And depending on what kind of business it is or, the commercial environment you're operating within, like the example I gave of a car dealership in Vegas. And the reason I use that example actually was one of my best friends who works as an attorney, or actually president of a firm. He was telling me a story about that one time where one of their clients had gone to Vegas and gotten intoxicated, been doing some gambling, and then had entered into some sort of dubious contract for a car or something or a boat, and they were having to then evaluate. So it actually came from a real world scenario, in case you were wondering. But it also just goes to show that, um, you know, if you can imagine it, there's probably been a legal case out there where it comes up. And if you're a corporate lawyer or you're a law firm or you're a business owner, just kind of keep in mind, um, that if you've got employees who are out who have the ability to negotiate on your behalf, you want to make sure that they're in their right frame of mind before entering into these deals. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in and look at chapter 10, which looks at performance, breach, and remedies. So one of the biggest questions, when you're studying contract law is what happens if the contract is not fulfilled? What are the outcomes of that? What is it called? What does it look like? What role does the court play in any of this? So let's kind of dive in. So two words I want y'all to know, first of all, is performance and discharge. Performance is where you are actually engaging in the fulfilling of the contract. So for instance, going back to the paint of my neighbor's fence, as they're, as a crew comes out and they're painting the fence, they're actually engaging in the performance of the contract. And then once they complete it, they've successfully completed performance. And then the, if the consumer, my neighbor, is happy with it and they pay it and everybody shakes hands and they're done, that means that the contract has been successfully discharged. The contractual obligations have been successfully discharged. Obviously, if they paint the fence a color that the neighbors aren't happy with or they're not happy with performance, then that's where we're going to get into looking at, well, what does that mean? So let's go ahead and do that. And one of the things about your book that I really like is they do have a tendency to use some really good visuals. So on my page 276, Exhibit 10.3, when they're talking about contract discharge, they have a really good graph. I'll show it to you right here. You can see it. So that right there, that's actually pretty good. I like it. And the first thing that we're going to talk about before we get to that are called conditions. And conditions are very common in many types of contracts. So for instance, I'll give you some real world examples. In real estate, Oftentimes, a contract is dependent upon financing, like being able to finance it, and an inspection. Um, Buying of a car, especially a used car, uh, there may be conditions on it that it has to satisfy an inspection to make sure that there's actually an engine and it works and all that. Um, and so if an inspection fails, or financing isn't obtained, then the contract then is not allowed really to go forward because it's a condition of that contract. And that is called a condition precedent. Condition precedent is anything that has to be satisfied as a term or a check to ensure that the contract can actually go forward. And that's very, very common. A lot of times contracts will say this contract is contingent upon X, Y, and Z. In professional sports, I don't know how many sports fans we have out there, but if you're, right now, NFL, the football is gearing up for a new season. And so there's a lot of personnel moves happening, players being signed, players being traded. And a lot of times those trades from one team to another of personnel are contingent upon a physical to make sure that they're not injured or have any debilitating condition that would negate that deal. So those are called condition precedents. So let's talk a little bit about how contracts are discharged. Okay, because this graph actually has 5 different zones of contractual discharge. So the first one is by performance, where there's been complete, substantial, and basically everybody's happy, or as happy as one could be. So, for instance, the crew comes out, does my neighbor's fence. The neighbor comes out and says, "Oh my gosh, it looks amazing. Hey, Mike, look at this. You should use them sometime. Next time you want your fence done." And the crew says, "Thank you." Takes a credit card, and everybody walks away happy. That would be, I could say, "Hey, congratulations. This contract has been successfully discharged by successful substantial completion." And they'll probably just roll their eyes and walk away because nobody talks like that outside of law, but that's essentially what's happened. That's how many, many contracts are completed. Now, the next aspect is what happens, and I don't know if I did say it this way, but what happens if performance is substantially performed, not everything? Well, the more complex a contract is, especially when you're talking about something like building a house, lots of ways that errors can happen or mistakes can happen. But what happens if you have a contract of that nature and the purchasers, the buyers, aren't 100% happy? Does that mean they don't have to pay? Does that mean they get out of the contract? No. That's called substantial performance, because the law understands that there are going to be instances where the other side is not going to be, quote unquote, 100% happy. And so substantial performance, as outlined, is the party had to perform the act in good faith. It must not vary greatly from the performance promised. Any defects or any problems have to be minor. And, essentially performance must create substantially the same benefits. So for instance, let's use the fence, for example. Let's say that my neighbors had seen in a magazine a fence, and they had it in their minds they wanted to look exactly that way. And they tell the business, "Hey, I want my fence to look exactly like this." And the fence company says, "Sure, we'll do our best." Okay. So the neighbors come home from a trip and they see their fence, they hold up the magazine, and they're like, "Hey, this isn't exactly right." And the company says, "What do you mean? We use the same color, we can't make it exactly like this in the magazine because who knows? The magazine that could have been enhanced by AI. It could have been photoshopped. What we did our absolute best to try to make you happy. So the neighbors say, well, we're not paying for this. Okay. And the company says, yes, you are, because we, we acted in good faith. This fence looks, to the objective viewer, looks almost exactly the same. We're sorry it doesn't look exactly that, but it's two different fences. The lighting could be different. Who knows? But you could see how, if there wasn't a substantial performance aspect to this, that company could really run into this problem all the time, where someone's like, well, that's just not what I wanted, or it doesn't look exactly the way I had in my mind. So that's why there is built into law the idea of substantial performance. All right. Now let's go on and move ahead into what happens if there is a breach of contract. So a breach is the non-performance of a contractual duty. And so let's say that the company just painted it a completely wrong color or only painted it halfway. That's not substantial performance. That is going to be what's called a material breach. And so courts have to decide what constitutes a material breach. And in this case, if there was material breach by the fence painter, my neighbors would be excused from paying because the contract would not have been, they wouldn't have been performed. And so what ends up happening is, in a material breach of contract, the neighbors could potentially sue them for breach of contract. Because now what's going to happen is they're going to have to pay for another company to fix whatever the mistake was or complete because of the material breach. All right. Another example that is equal to a material breach, or is considered a type of material breach, is a famous phrase in contract law called anticipatory repudiation. Anticipatory repudiation. That's where somebody basically says, we're not going to complete this project. Do with it as you want. I mean, you're basically making either explicit or implicit overtures that you are not going to fulfill your side of the contract. That's called anticipatory repudiation. It's very a famous phrase, and that is the equivalent of a material breach. So the contract would then be discharged if they said that. All right. So basically, and in 10.4, they kind of visually show you what I was just talking about is complete performance. They painted it. The customers are happy. No breach. Contract is discharged. Substantial performance, duty to perform is there. And that means that the customers would have to pay. Material breach, contract is discharged. It's because that breach is significant enough, either by it's just a defective or it's incorrect, or there's been anticipatory repudiation. So that's called by breach. All right. So that takes care of performance by breach. And then there's also, again, by failure of condition. So if it fails an inspection, a physical examination, appraisal, something like that, that means a contract is discharged because there's been a failure of a condition or a condition precedent. And that just means a condition that had to have been satisfied before the contract is able to go forward, precedent. All right, the last two we're going to look at in this area is by agreement and by operation of law. So let's talk about discharge by agreement. So discharge by agreement is the first one example would be called mutual rescission. It's where the parties just agree together to cancel their contract. They will each release the other from future contractual obligations. Let's say, for instance, my neighbors had contracted with this company, and then they decide that they really don't want to get their fence done now, but they're kind of They're like, wow, we signed this contract. So they contact the company. The company says, oh, this actually works out great. We overcommitted. We're not going to be able to get to you anyway. We're trying to figure out how to deal with this. So let's just go our separate ways. That's called mutual rescission. Another type is called novation. And that is where they enter basically here's a good example of novation. So novation could be something where my neighbors decide, wow, we really don't want our fence done, but hey, our neighbor across the street, Mike, he was interested in getting his fence done. And they get together and the company says, okay, well, we'll let you out of your deal and we'll just negotiate with Mike then on the same contract. It's on the same street. We're ready to go, and we'd rather, have the customer that's satisfied than get into this, unworkable situation with you. So it's basically an agreement to substitute of a new contract with the old one. And, they enter into contract with me now. And so novation does happen. I just using the fence example, but you could see that happening where they had, I hadn't really planned on getting my fence done. And then the company says, well, hey, your neighbor said that you might be interested. We're willing to give you a deal, Mike, and we're going to let them out of their contract. And we'll give you a discount if you let us put a sign on your fence. And, what do you think? I'm like, okay, I haven't been thinking about it, but now that you mentioned it, this might work. And that way they're like, yeah, they're like, are you okay with this color? Because we already had it purchased and, we want to use it. I'm like, yeah, it looks great. So innovation can happen. I was trying to think of a good example. Another a type by agreement would be what's called accord and satisfaction. And this sometimes happens where, for example, let's say that the neighbors had entered into agreement with the company to paint their fence a dark brown. And the company mixes up on their invoice and they give them a red color fence. And and they're like, oh, great. So the neighbors come home, they see the red fence, they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that was an option. I love it. And the company says, really? Okay. So they agreed to accept performance different than what was originally promised. They were going to go with a dark brown, and now they have a red fence. And so that would be called accord and satisfaction. And basically, another vocabulary word is release. Is a contract in which one person basically, one side forfeits or gives up their ability to sue the other. They're basically saying, hey, I release you. And releases in contract are very common. You're released from any form of future liability or any, future performance or anything like that. Okay. And then the last type is what's called by operation of law. And this can happen in a number of different ways. For example, there might be bankruptcy. So, bankruptcy can, if the fence company goes bankrupt, they're not going to be able to really paint the fence. So that might be an example of discharge by operation of law. Impossibility of performance, that, let's say that the warehouse where they stored the gear or the equipment or supplies for painting fences burned down or was hit by, an earthquake or something of that nature. That would make impossibility of performance. All right. Then you've got some other areas in which, depending on the type of contract, where there's impossibility or impracticability of performance. For instance, if there had been a contract for a band to play in at a venue and the lead singer, lost their voice for, a month or something like that, that would be something where you basically have an impossibility of performance. And so all of these are just examples of how contracts can potentially be discharged in one way or the other. Some are, I guess if you want to use it this way, happier than others. So that leads us to the concept of damages. In contract law, just like we were talking about with negligence, there's different types of damages that can be obtained. That includes things like compensatory to cover direct losses and costs, consequential, which cover any indirect or foreseeable losses, punitive, to really punish an industry or a company if they engaged in really horrific, business practices or something like that, or have a history of it, such as a, construction building contractor or something like that. If they have a history of basically not performing and leaving clients kind of out in the cold. There was an article, and I don't have a link to it, but I remember reading about it a couple summers ago, and they were talking about this company in North Texas that apparently was being sued in class action, which is where you bring together many different plaintiffs for similar reasons, and they basically jointly sue an entity or entities. And this home builder was being accused of over-promising, taking money, really creating an unworkable and untenable situation for the customers, because the customers were having to figure out, they were trying to figure out where they're going to live, having to pay exorbitant rent, as opposed because they'd already sold their home. And so rather than being able to move in as expected, the home builder was saying, well, it's now going to be months or years before your house is completed or something of that nature. So it was really just a mess. And so they were asking for all kinds of damages, compensatory, consequential, punitive. And if I find the article, I will send it. But that's the nature of damages. And so, depending on what the subject of the contract is, that's going to often drive what kind of damages you're going to see. All right, don't want to get too much into that. Let's see. Okay. So in addition to damages that are numerical in nature, there's also what are called equitable remedies. And so there are different types of equitable damages that may arise in this situation. So let's give you some vocabulary in this realm. First of all, we've talked about rescission, where a contract is taken away, or you're basically putting the parties back to the position they were in. I want to cover that. Okay. All right. And then another type of equitable remedy is called specific performance. This is where instead of money, because sometimes money is just not going to do it, a court orders the parties perform as promised in the contract. And it's basically done where there's only one of something, whether it's the land or, a piece of merchandise, or perhaps a performance by a certain individual. That's called specific performance. It's where money is just not going to do it, or the way they say it is monetary relief would be inadequate. All right. Another term, again, is reformation, where the parties, there's been some sort of error or mistake, or there's some impasse, and the court orders correction of a written contract so that it reflects the true intention to try to get everybody going in the direction that they want to go. All right. So basically, when you think about remedies available in contracts, what I really wanted y'all to take from this is that you have rescission, letting people out, there's specific performance, where the exact what was being bargained for is being ordered, reformation, where the court basically helps put the contract and the parties in a direction that they were intending to go anyway, or damages if it gets to that level and you're asking for monetary relief of some type. Okay, perfect. That's actually a good rendition of that, and that gives you all a good working knowledge of what constitutes discharge of a contract and what a breach is and the differences between a material breach and substantial performance, and then some of the ways that contracts can be discharged and and how that kind of plays out, and then what are some of the ways that people are compensated for contractual problems, and whether that's the court trying to correct it, letting them out, having actual monetary damages, specific performance. That's all part and parcel. So again, just remember that damages is one type of remedy, and then equitable remedies is everything else, like specific performance and rescission and reformation, all that. All right. All right. So again, I really appreciate y'all hanging in there as we navigate this. Again, each of these topics, as you're probably getting an idea, you could take weeks looking at different cases and examples, et cetera, which we don't have, and that's not really the point of this class. But to give you all a working understanding of these different elements of contracts, and contractual breaches and remedies, et cetera, is really important. All right, I'll go ahead and get this closed out and posted, and then we are almost to the end of this module. Just a couple more, actually probably one more lecture, and then your exam will be posted. So thanks as always.